Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Do we need to reestablish a quorum?
Yes, sorry. Go ahead, Dorita. Yes, we do.
Okay, so it's now 2 o'clock and we will resume. But before we resume, I'll call on a Parliamentarian Johnson so that a quorum may be reestablished.
Yes.
Present. If you're gonna.
I'm sorry. Um, Madam Chair,
Present.
Madam, Vice Chair Brown, Member Grills, can, can you hear me?
Member Grills isn't on screen.
Oh, okay, thank you. Member Bradford? Member
Bradford
Holder?
Chair.
Okay, thank you. Member Holder?
What are they asking, Chris? They want the camera on?
Present.
Thank you.
What?
Member Jones Sawyer?
He's here.
Okay, thank you. Member Lewis?
Where's the rest
Here.
of them? They're
I
all
see.
showing up.
Member Tamaki?
Here.
I see, thank you. Member Montgomery Stepp? And then I'll call again Vice Chair Brown and Member Grills.
Present.
Thank you. Madam Chair, there are 7 members present. The task force consists of 9 members. 5 are needed for a quorum. With 7, a quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. So now that a quorum has been reestablished, the meeting has now been officially called back to order. Sorry, excuse me for the technical difficulties. I've been experiencing them all morning. And so I only have a few slides left, but I also want to acknowledge the panelists. I guess I was a bit thrown off since Kevin Brown couldn't make it. I know that there might be some questions from the task force members to the panelists who had just finished presenting. So I just want to hold some space. I'm going to give 5 minutes of time for that. In the event that task force members has any questions to the panelists who are still on the call with us. Okay, and now I see
Do we know
Kevin
who's
Brown is here.
do we know on the call still? I can't see anybody, so I don't know who's still.
I'm still
Let me
here.
see.
Greg Carr is here.
Yeah, Greg Carr is here.
Carr is here, Jim, Hollis, all the genealogists, I believe, all the presenters are here. And then I see Kevin Brown is here. So Kevin, could you give a truncated kind of synopsis of what you plan to present? I'm so sorry that we have been so bad with time management, but the technical difficulties are really the result of it. So Kevin, do you have can you just give, a synopsis, no more than 5 minutes, and I will be timing you.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, Madam Chair and honorable members of the task force. Kevin Brown, and I am one of the founders of Evanston Rejects Racist Reparations. We are a group that organized as a result of the reparations effort in Evanston, Illinois, which is being lauded as the first municipal-oriented reparations program in the United States. Our group formed as a result of the effort for reparations and to really try to acquire what we deem as an authentic, excuse me, reparations program. Unfortunately, what I was going to present on today really was to give the task force some understanding about the effort that was ongoing or is ongoing in Evanston, which our community group does not really feel represents a true reparations program, but more a social equity program that has essentially been renamed reparations. And we support the efforts that are going on in California for lineage reparations. We believe in that. But we wanted really California and the nation to know that what is happening in Evanston is not reparations. It is more a group of individuals who've come together essentially to monetize reparations. That is how we view it. Turning a housing program in Evanston into a reparations program is an effort to monetize reparations, because what has happened, groups like NCOBRA and NARC, who are advising members of the Evanston City Council, are seeking, not in Evanston, but in other communities, compensation in order to what they term is consult on how cities and municipalities should organize a reparations effort. We are opposed to that. And what has happened in Evanston is essentially very quickly, 16 individuals were chosen by lottery in our community, people who were deemed as being harmed in from 1919 until 1969 through our housing discrimination. There was no lineage attached to it. There was no organized study to actually determine the harm or exactly who was harmed. And our city cannot even tell its residents who is actually eligible for these programs. We think that the effort being lauded as a national model is very erroneous, and we don't want to see California, we don't want to see other states or other cities or municipalities make the mistakes that have been made in Evanston. We think that it's really an effort for a group of individuals to really enrich themselves on the backs of what people would call reparations. That's really all we wanted to kind of say today, and we wanted to really underscore the fact that we do believe that reparations should be based on lineage because of the original promises that were made to our ancestors who were enslaved by this country. So thank you for an opportunity to share, and if there are any questions about what is happening in the city of Evanston, we would be happy to share with you and communicate with you on these efforts. I will say that the program itself has been a disaster so far. It's taken almost 2 years for even an award to be made. And in the awards that have been made, they do not go directly to the individuals who qualified for this particular reparations program. The actual dollars go to the banks that actually committed most of the racist harm that occurred in the past. So thank you again for the opportunity, and we appreciate you giving us a moment to share.
Thank you. At this time, do any task force members have any questions for the panelists? Okay, I think to reorient a bit, I'm going to ask each panelist to say, what if you could impart your advice, would you impart the advice of a pure lineage standard or race-based? It could be just less than a sentence, less than 2 sentences. So I'll start with the order of the speakers. So Dr. Evelyn McDowell, are you still on?
Yes, I'm still here. I definitely feel that a lineage-based program is appropriate. Regarding, based on my presentation, it's something that we can do. It is something that is necessary and needed. There really are estimates of 10 million people who were enslaved in this country, and we're still waiting for our apology. We're still waiting for some measure of justice. The wealth gap is huge, and we definitely need a lineage-based reparation program. So that's my opinion.
Thank you. Dr. Harrell, I see you, and then Dr. Semple, and then Dr. Gentry. And just keep the comments brief. Thank you. Dr. Harrell, you're on mute.
Yes, given all that I've heard today, I would say that lineage-based is important, and when documentation runs dry, a sworn notarized affidavit works in court, because like I stated earlier, that everyone may not be able to research their family history due to the lack of records that's available. But I do want to say this, that in the study for reparations, there should be fundings allocated to different nonprofit organizations that can help those that want to research their family history, but may not have the fundings to do so. That's just as equally important to me.
Thank you for that. Dr. Semple?
I agree that it should be lineage-based. I would add to that the broadest possible combination of documents that we might provide, prove our descendancy from the formerly enslaved, will be very important. So not just one document that is approved as the standard, but perhaps many that will allow us to include the broadest possible group.
Thank you. Dr. Gentry?
I support lineage-based criteria, and also on the list of suggestions that I provided, I recommended 2 things. First, that you conduct a survey of the types of records that would be considered acceptable to prove enslavement. And the second part, as a beginning pilot, to survey the records for California for African American sources to give you an idea of what's available to assist Californians who would be part of this community of eligibility and identifying records that they can access, not simply looking at Ancestry or Family Search. Be aware of the fact that Family Search is supported by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who formerly enslaved African Americans. So be mindful of the sources of these records, and also with the institutions who are stewards to these records, that there's bias oftentimes in the stewards and are gaining access to these documents. So be mindful of that in the process of requiring documentation for that.
Thank you for that. Dr. Burrows?
Yes, based on the testimony of the chair as well as Mr. Champion, it seems that lineage-based is required, and so I support that. And I think there's ample guidelines to that are set forth that have been established for quite a while to show how people can trace their lineage back into the slavery period. So as long as you use standards, I definitely agree with it.
Thank you. Dr. Farish?
I think it's important that it's lineage based, and I don't think that it's quite necessary to go all the way back to the 1870 census. I think you can find traces of enslaved ancestors in other census records and in other records, period. I also believe that looking at the actual records, Ancestry.com, Family Search, those are websites that compile the information, but you're not looking at information that is specific to them. You're looking at US Census records, you're looking at World War I and World War II draft cards, and all of those tools are available individually by themselves without going through those research websites, but they are also available on those websites. And I think it's important that we use the tools that are available, and that if we are unable to link everyone, then we should have an attestation, as was stated before.
Thank you. Dr. Carr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would say that if the only two options are race and lineage, lineage probably makes, as we know, the most sense. Race would not survive a legal challenge. I'm not sure that lineage will either, particularly given, how we define the harm. And that's why I would say finally that I think my comments, which are probably beyond the scope of this particular hearing, which is why I urge this committee to continue in some form beyond its mandate, if that's possible, would be to really try to rethink this notion of the class that is harmed. If there's possibly getting a membership in a harm category as defined globally as Black people, with local policy recommendations shaped to the policies that we find ourselves in, I think ultimately that's where the future of reparations lies, because nothing has been achieved by Black people in this country without external pressure. So
Thank
I
you.
think that's a very different concept. But yeah, I would say lineage is probably the one that, as you know, would survive legal challenge more favorably. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Jessica Ann Mitchell-Ayawar.
Thank you. I understand the importance of lineage, but I also warn that I don't think we are all operating from the same definition of lineage, and I think that is going to be a challenge moving forward. I also warn that it will be costly, time-consuming, and assumes accessibility. Additionally, I warn that if the state of California were to pursue lineage-based off of the definition of purely chattel slavery, that the state of California could then opt to only offer reparations to those that can prove lineage of descendancy of a person that was enslaved within the state, and that many, if not the majority, of Black Californians would then not qualify because they are the descendants of Black Southern migrants from other states.
All right, thank you. Marcus
I
Champion.
would go to harms-based.
Thank you. Marcus Champion. Marcus Champion.
Yeah, can you
Mike
guys hear me?
Davis. Oh yeah, we can hear you. Mhm.
I would say, besides what's logical and what's just, the legal side requires that this be a lineage standard, because a race standard will violate Proposition 209 as well as the 14th Amendment. So whatever came out of this will be thrown out in the court of law. Also, for those who say that there's an accessibility issue, I agree with Dr. Harrell that the state, as a part of this, opened up an office, a government office similar to Japanese redress, the Office of Redress Administration, which was completely in charge of the eligibility, including finding people who were eligible. So to sum it up, a lineage standard.
Thank you, Mike Davis. Dr. Mike Davis, excuse me. Mike Davis, is he still on the call? Do I see him? He might have got out, but Kevin Brown. Kevin Brown?
Yes.
No, Kevin Brown. Okay.
Oops.
Your position? Please
Are
say your
you,
position.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. As I said before in our short testimony, we support lineage-based reparations. We do believe in mostly what has been articulated thus far. We believe there are pathways to support lineage. There might be vehicles through, the advent of whatever documentation is necessary. But we're supportive of lineage reparations.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions from the task force members to the panelists before we move on?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
just
have
have what. Go ahead, Member Holder. Sorry, again.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all of the witnesses for your testimony. I do have a question, especially given some of the descriptions of the challenges to actually finding the documentation of your enslaved ancestry in the United States. So, are there any benchmarks, like statistical, numerical benchmarks, as to just generally, overall, how many people in the diaspora come from an enslaved ancestry? And generally, how many people in the United States come from enslaved ancestry? I mean, I've read articles that say 90% of the people in the diaspora, of Black people, 90% of the people in the African diaspora descend from enslaved people. Are there benchmarks like that that we can use as a guideline to help us so that we can get away from forcing people to meticulously document their enslaved ancestry and just have certain benchmarks and assumptions about the percentage of Black people that were enslaved?
Not to my knowledge.
I would like to answer that in part. There is no answer to that question. We have yet to be able to document who was enslaved. And so this is the major challenge. The project that I'm working with the Smithsonian, the Freedmen's Bureau records, it's 2 million images, 2 million records that document part of the population who was enslaved as they emerged as citizens. These records were recorded right after the passage of those Reconstruction era amendments to the Constitution. We still don't know. There is a major effort to try to understand who was enslaved and how to document them, which is why when I added in my suggestions that you survey the records that are available. We tend to focus only on looking at people who were enslaved in the South. Slavery was practiced in the North for quite a long time, and we tend to overlook that when we discuss who is part of that community of eligibility. You know, just take the whole sweep of the country, and Dr. Harrell's research is showing us that, and her decades of tireless work shows us that there were people who were enslaved well after 1865 and who inherited or were forced into peonage. And there are people living today who experience that. So to try to quantify that is going to be very challenging. What we can do is identify the records that document enslavement. We can begin to make them accessible to the research community, and then we will begin to have answers in terms of numbers and areas and specific states or under whatever circumstances they were enslaved and identified in that manner. Then we'll be able to count or quantify the numbers who are part of the descendant community.
Thank you. I would like to also say that I live in Louisiana, and I am working presently in the records in St. Helena Courthouse, and thank the Heavenly Father that the courthouse never had a fire. So what I did, I sort of made copies of all the slaveholders, and so I'm going through their inventory and their succession records and building a database for each one of them. And it's very time consuming, but it's well worth it and very needed. So I can do really have a great analysis of just how many people was enslaved in St. Helena Parish.
I think it's important to look at the laws in the country at the time.
Right.
So most African Americans that are considered African Americans, they only came to the United States one way. and that was through the slave ship. Whether or not when they got here during colonial America, or whether they got here and were enslaved in Pennsylvania, where slavery ended in 1783, if they got here by a slave ship, the intention of their stay here was to be a slave.
That's right.
And so prior to 1900, you can look at the fact that there are no voluntary immigrants from African, Caribbean, or other countries in the African diaspora into the United States. So there is only one class of people that are here. And if you were to trace your ancestry back to this period of time, it isn't necessary for you to name an enslaved ancestor, because you know that every one of your color, ilk, and type that are here only because they were enslaved. This does not regard free people of color as not being in this system. Free from what? You were enslaved. So the whole purpose, to answer your question, Mrs. Holder, is that the litmus test that you use is if you were in the United States at a certain time when there were no other persons here, then that would prove on its face that you descend from American chattel slavery, whether slavery ended for your ancestors in the 1600s, in the 1700s, or 1865.
I would agree with that.
I want to counter that. Can I counter it a little bit? There were indeed immigrants of African and Caribbean descent coming into this country. A lot of the mariners who are coming in, if you look at the records, the court records on the East Coast, a lot of them were not allowed to come on shore, and if they did, they were arrested and jailed. And if they could not prove their free status, they were enslaved. And this is throughout the 19th century. I can tell you all of the major port cities, especially in the southern states, had this practice. If you were, this speaks to Dr. Ira Berlin's premise that if you were brown or black or anything other than white, the assumption was you were enslaved or you were connected somehow to enslavement, regardless of whether you had a freeborn status. You were treated in that manner.
Those people.
Right.
Then those people are included on their face.
Yes, they would. Yes, but they came voluntarily as free people, and there are individuals who were enslaved, although freeborn. In Delaware, there was a woman, Patty Cannon. Dr. Charles Bloxton talks about people who were kidnapped, who were freeborn and enslaved and sold as enslaved people. So there are these cases of individuals who do appear in records who were reborn or who came here voluntarily from other nations, but were treated or regarded.
Well, Dr.
That's all I want to say.
No,
Okay, we're going to have to go in that order. I can't see everybody who's on the screen, so I don't know who.
I think that's Greg Carr.
I'd like to jump in.
A word in for a second. I'm just going to agree with
hold
you, Dr.
on,
Gentry.
I didn't recognize anyone yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it's Dr. Greg. Yes, Dr. Greg Carr would like to be recognized, and Dr. Evelyn McDowell. Is there anybody else? Because we're going to have to cut the responses to this question. Okay, so I'll let Dr. Carr and then Dr. McDowell. Go ahead, Dr. Carr.
Very quickly, I thank you. This really is the question. How do you establish the status? It would be impossible to trace through documents. The 750,000 Africans in the country in 1790, the first census, 1860, you got about 4 million enslavement. So you've asked the question that needs to be asked. There's no way to do it. If you can establish that reparations claim, maybe by the end of the 19th century, certainly then moving forward to be a different kind of thing. We know Dred Scott establishes the fact that even in places where there were quote free blacks, there's no enforceable status for black people that is unassailable, even in the law. This is the point Tani is making. It's not remedied in the Civil War amendments, and so that's why I said I think the next step beyond this legislation is to try to establish a harm claim that precedes the formation of the polities. Because as we know, with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, California comes into the polity as a free state. So if you start making no argument, that's one of the reasons that California and Maine come in 1850. But I'll conclude with this. I think any attempt to try to establish a claim based on records is ultimately a cul-de-sac that cannot be overcome. That claim has to be established as one that you have the presumption you are in the class unless you are shown not to be in the class. And I think that's the next stage in something that is a work in progress in terms of the reparation claim.
Thank you.
And,
Dr.
and to follow up,
McDowell.
yeah, and to follow up on that, what I suggest is that it's much more feasible to identify those people who voluntarily immigrated to the United States during the time of slavery and come up with a database with those names. And if your ancestor lived or born in this country before the end of slavery, chattel slavery, then you would go to this database, type in your name of your ancestor. It's not there? Okay, you are eligible. Your ancestor is eligible for reparations. So I wholeheartedly support the creation of this database. Is much easier and is simpler than just coming up with all of the people who were enslaved, because there were more people enslaved than there were people who voluntarily immigrated here.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDowell, and thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you for being patient and working with us through these technical difficulties. Really appreciate all of your testimony and your contributions. So now we're going to return back to my presentation, and I only have a few slides left, so it won't take too long. And then we'll go to the task force for discussion and resolution of the issue. So can the DOJ put the presentation back up, please? I'll note the slide 24.
We're working on those slides. I think we have phone calls going to try to get people onto Blue Jeans.
Maybe I can just share my screen or I'll wait. It's fine.
If you want to go ahead with your discussion, we'll try to get the presentation up as soon as we can.
Okay, one moment.
Okay, they're up, Chair Moore. The slides are back up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So essentially, these are the four pages of the We Charge Unicide petition filed by human rights lawyers Paul Robeson and William A. Patterson, along with other African Americans. And essentially, their argument was that the United States was responsible for enacting and being complicit in committing genocide against African American people, particularly due to the lynchings of African Americans. And essentially, their argument is that our numbers, the African American descendant of persons enslaved in the United States, our numbers would be much larger in the United States if it wasn't for our slow and protracted genocide. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are 4 documents that I pulled to show that African American is a distinct political and historical identifier that has been used at least since 1782 to describe, Black Americans who descend from chattel slavery in the United States. So 1782 is a pamphlet written by an African American dated April 1782. There's the Afro-American Council that Booker T. Washington founded in 1898, and then the next picture is in 1899, which was a session held in St. Paul, Minnesota, to protest against the countless African American deaths at the time. And then 1968, you have Queen Mother Audley Moore, who wrote a pamphlet for African Americans, and it says African Americans at the top left, why reparations money for Negroes. Next slide. So the next slide, and I won't read all of this, but this is also showing a distinction between African Americans and, for instance, West Indians in the 20th century. So before large number of Caribbean migrants in the late 90s. So even here, this is a really interesting law review article where they're talking about why Black homeowners are more likely to be Caribbean American than African American in New York. It's a theory of how early West Indian migrants broke racial cartels in housing. And essentially, what this author is saying that you would think, right, that, for instance, West Indian Americans have long presented this It says, why are Black brownstone owners in Harlem and Brooklyn disproportionately West Indian? The landlords West Indian, the tenants African American. These are tough questions for students of housing discrimination. West and Indian Americans have long presented a quandary. If it is reasonable to assume that racial exclusions are being consistently applied to persons who are dark-skinned, one would expect to find that housing discrimination has had similar effects on West Indian Americans and African Americans. Yet this is not the case. West Indian Americans generally own and rent higher quality housing than African Americans. And then they talk about why that's the case, right? And they say, then first they continue to ask, since West Indians are overwhelmingly dark-skinned persons of African descent, they typically did not have the option of passing that may have been available to other groups. So what explains their high home ownership rates as compared to African Americans? And so this author states quite clearly, right, that West Indian brokers in New York were simply replicating the techniques that had been utilized by their land brokering ancestors. She talks about in the British West Indian Islands, where migrants originated, there was this busting of white monopolies in land ownership, particularly throughout the West Indian colonies, and contravention of racial norms in the British colonies of who was allowed to own land and where. So upon arrival in New York, these West Indians encountered another racial monopoly in real property ownership, namely Northern racial segregation, and they essentially appropriated the same techniques that they had utilized in the West Indies to break into white neighborhoods in New York. So that's a slide to show the distinction between West Indians and African Americans, even in the early 20th century. And it shows how West Indians were able to acquire more homes and more quality homes because they utilized land brokering and racial busting techniques that they had learned in their former plantation economies in the West Indies. Next slide. So again, the history of the reparations advocacy movement, particularly in California and the United States, shows and demonstrates that we have to come up with a lineage-based model of reparations. Particularly, we talked about Callie House. Mary Frances Berry was an expert and gave her testimony about how Callie House was an ex-slave and upon emancipation created the first reparations movement organization. And then, and I quote, she was harassed by the government, and government officials worried that the pension movement or the reparations movement is setting the Negroes wild, making anarchists of them. And history repeats itself because that language is still being used to apply to Black Americans who are advocating for a lineage model. And then also in the state of California, you have Queen Mother Audley Moore, who created the organization, the Reparations Committee for United States Slave Descendants in 1962. And her office was in Los Angeles, California on Jefferson Boulevard. In fact, Queen Mother Audley Moore coined the term DOAS, descendants of American slavery. This is a pamphlet that talks that she published in 1962 called the Reparations Committee for Descendants of American Slaves. Next slide. Again, that is another excerpt from her pamphlet around advocating for reparations, particularly for descendants of American slaves, through her organization, the Reparations Committee for United States Slave Descendants in 1962. Also, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. The third point in their 10-point program was about reparations, and I quote, "We believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. 40 acres and 2 mules was promised for 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of Black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The Germans are now aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people. The Germans murdered 6 million Jews. The American racist has taken part in the slaughter of over 50 million Black people. Therefore, we feel that this is a modest demand that we make." So these slides show in the specific California context and the broader United States context with Queen Mother Ali Moore's organization, the Black Panther Party, Callie House, and Paul Robeson and William A. Patterson's We Charge Genocide petition. Reparations advocacy groups have always advocated for a lineage-based model. Next slide. Again, I won't talk too much about this, but in the event that all Black people in this country are, described as African American, I just want to put on record that there is a trend towards data disaggregation. It's already been happening with the Asian American Pacific Islander community, where they have been fighting for over 10 years, particularly in the state of New York, to get data disaggregated in terms of their ethnicity. And the new New York Governor, Kathy Hochul, actually signed the data disaggregation bill into law in December of last year. And the Asian American group advocated for this data disaggregation, not to be divisive, not to separate the AAPI community, but to understand that each group within the AAPI community has distinct needs, and these distinct needs to be addressed, right? And so you see Felicia Persaud, who's Caribbean. She has fought for the Carib ID movement, where she says data on Caribbean nationals in the U.S. is currently sparse, based largely on the fact that this bloc has had no previous opportunity to self-identify in the past, but have been lumped in with African American, Asian American, and other communities, said Persaud. Hopefully this goes away. This goes a long way in making sure we count in 2020 the ability to write in Caribbean on the 2020 census, so we can receive the respect we deserve as a huge economic and political bloc in this country, and our communities and businesses that have been dismissed because of a lack of economic data can begin to thrive. Let's stand up and be counted. She also goes on to say, we need every single Caribbean national in the U.S. to make sure they count by filling out the form, writing in their ancestry, and returning it, said Carib ID's Felicia Persaud. Census numbers determine every aspect of our lives in this country, and right now we are largely invisible as we have no accurate means of identification on the form. We must make sure we end this trend by counting not just our ethnicities, but our nationalities in this census, so we can all win, or we can continue to be fooled and maintain the cycle of dismissal. So this is Felicia Persaud, a proud Caribbean person, saying Caribbean people in this country are rendered invisible because they're not allowed to identify how they'd like to identify as Caribbeans and West Indians on the census. And so this slide, again, AB 1604 just passed the Judiciary Committee, and that is a bill being led by CJEC and NAASD to disaggregate data amongst Black and African American groups, similar to what the AAPI community did in New York, and similar to what Felicia Persaud is advocating, because there's a growing understanding that as the society becomes more multicultural, the needs of everyone in this community needs to be visible in order to be addressed. Next slide. And in the interest of time, in terms of international law, when we talk about compensation. How do international courts interpret compensation eligibility for human rights violations? So this is from the Handbook of Reparations. It's like a 1,000-page book. It talks about case law models around the world. And essentially, the Inter-American Court has stated that, you know, there are two types of victims: those immediately injured by the violation, which in this context would be slavery, the direct victim, and his or her next of kin, who later suffer the consequences of their loved one's ordeal. So in any event, what this excerpt from the Handbook of Reparations is stating is that the injured party, as defined by the Inter-American Court in the American Convention, refers both to the direct victim of a human rights violation, as well as usually their close family members or dependents. So essentially, international law supports and substantiates a lineage-based claim, particularly when it comes to compensation eligibility. Next slide. And just lastly, when we talk about guarantees of non-repetition, again, these are excerpts from the Handbook of Reparations. There is an understanding among international law scholars that guarantees of non-repetition usually are not fully fulfilled promptly or completely by the states, because it requires guarantees of non-repetition, right? A complete, I guess you could say, a complete end to the ultimate causes of the violations and impunity. And so I'm saying that to say, one, guarantees of non-repetition and a lineage-based approach are not mutually exclusive. You can formulate reparations proposals in the form of guarantees of non-repetition, and they still can be lineage-specific, but you should not use GNRs to argue against a lineage-based approach, because usually GNRs in this specific context would be police and prison abolition, right? I don't know if all members of this task force are ready to propose that to the state legislature, particularly at this time that we're in. So don't allow GNRs to be a straw man around advocating against a lineage-based proposal. Next slide. And again, when we talk about GNRs, the guarantees of non-repetition, for particularly the institution of slavery, you have to talk about the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So Section 1 is the crime exception clause, but Section 2 talks about giving Congress or empowering Congress to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery, right? And so when the 13th Amendment was enacted, it was enacted with a particular group of people in mind, namely descendants of enslaved people. So when we talk about GNRs, you have to then, bring into the conversation the 13th Amendment and bringing in the state legislature and the federal legislature's role and responsibility to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery as it pertains to a particular group of people, which are those descendants of those actual enslaved people. Next slide. And this is the second to last slide, and it's a question that I've been thinking about. Let's say there is a race-based standard. How do you measure Blackness, knowing that Blackness is a self-selecting category? So for instance, Mindy Kaling, the actress, her brother actually pretended to be Black in order to get into medical school, and he wrote a book about it called The True Story of How I Got into Medical School by Pretending to be Black. So essentially, just thinking ahead, if there is a race-based approach, what would we do? Well, we have to just take people's word for it in terms of their Blackness. That would allow people like Rachel Dolezal and this person who is not Black in any respect and not a descendant of slave, but then we would have to prescribe to, the master's tools, which is race and racism and pseudoscience. Well, we have to measure the width of someone's nose, width of someone's lips, the color of someone's skin. This is how absurd a race-based standard could be. And then also, in terms of congressional record, this was a congressional record that I researched, that I actually got some research from the United Sons and Daughters of Freedmen, actually, which is an organization that has been educating and resurrecting the term freedmen. And I put this in my presentation last night because I thought it was very important. And this came from the U.S. Senate discussions around Chief Justice Roberts being brought onto the Supreme Court. And essentially, in this long record, it talks about the Freedmen's Bureau. And it says the opponents of the Freedmen's Bureau attacked the Bureau on the ground that it would apply to members of only one race. The response was that discrimination was justified in the interest of equality. Then someone responded, "We need a Freedmen's Bureau," said one supporter, "not because these people are Negroes, but because they are men who have been for generations despoiled their rights." Right? So in this congressional record, they're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, right? It wasn't created just to help people because they were Black. It was created to the difficult these generations of men who were despoiled of their rights. It was created to help them transition from slavery status to freedom. And then I wanted to bring up a tweet from Ambassador Lynn Thompson, was appointed by the Biden administration. She is not conservative in any way. She tweeted this a couple of days ago to mark the International Day of Remembrance of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. I wanted to share a few thoughts on the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade. This is personal for me. I'm a person of African descent, but more importantly, I am a descendant of slaves. Next slide. This last slide. Next slide, please. Slide. Hello, hello.
Do you need me to keep going?
Yeah, the next slide. This is the last slide. Can you hear me? Oh, go back. Go back. To the slide about Isabel Wilkerson with her picture. Okay, so again, so to end my comments, and I think the DOJ will talk about this because I have some suggestions for how we should frame the report. I think in analyzing AB 3121, given the legislative history, given the history of reparations advocacy in the state of California and the United States more broadly, all points to a lineage-specific or pure lineage model. And it also points to Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. She's the first African-American Pulitzer Prize in journalism. She also was one of the first expert witnesses on our task force in September about her book, Caste, and how caste or how racism is insufficient to describe the particular experiences of African-Americans who descend from chattel slavery. In fact, she said this to a community of Dalit Indians, or the untouchables, who she compared the African-American experience to. She said that she wrote a 600-page book about Jim Crow era in the American South, the time of naked white supremacy, but that the word racism did not appear anywhere in the narrative. I told them after spending 15 years studying the topic and hearing the testimony of survivors of the era, I realized that the term race and racism were insufficient. Caste was a more accurate term. And then she sets out the reasons why. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to read all these quotes. No, go back. I won't read all the quotes, but I want to read a few just to illustrate how caste. So a caste system, an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry traits, like being a descendant of enslaved person. Traits that would be in the abstract are ascribed life and death meaning, and in hierarchy favoring the dominant caste, which are Europeans, whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the rank groupings apart, distinct from one another, and in their sizes. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality. It's about which groups have it and which do not. It's about resources, which caste is seen as worthy and which are not. In America, race is the primary tool and visible decoy, the front man for caste. So you talk about caste and race is the skin. In order to dismantle racism, you first have to address caste. And so this book to consider this on everyone caught in the hierarchy, but it devotes significant attention to the poles of the American caste system. Those at the top being European Americans as a primary beneficiary, and then at the bottom, African Americans, assume the caste has directed its full power organization. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. If you just go to the slide where it resembles the first slide, where it says lineage, 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 go back to that. Anyways, thank you.
Chair Moore?
Hello. Can I do a point of order?
Please, yes, please.
Actually, but I have a lot to say, but let me, just for the sake of time and for the rest of the committee members,
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
on a point of order.
Scott Lewis,
Can you hear me? Because I think you're breaking up, Chair Moore.
She recognized me.
Okay.
yeah,
on the point of,
yeah, I recognize Member Scott Lewis. Yeah.
oh. You recognize as who?
Me.
Member Scott Lewis.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so to help structure and direct the remainder of our time, which is very little, I'd like to introduce a motion. And I move that we define the community of eligibility based on lineage determined by an individual being an African American descendant of a chattel enslaved person or the descendant of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century.
I thought we were.
This is Montgomery.
Excuse me, Madam Chair, the point of order takes precedence.
Thank you. So let me just begin with.
What is going on?
On point of order,
he raised a
takes
point of
precedence.
order which can interrupt, and it takes precedence, so he has the right to the
Sorry,
floor.
I didn't hear anything. My internet is very choppy. So, point of order, go ahead. You may proceed.
I believe right now, as I look at the agenda, it had 10 witnesses and testimony. I believe, and I could be wrong, the chair gave witness just now, which took up about 45 minutes, half hour, and it's not agendized with presentations and things of that nature. I believe every member here probably should have the same amount of time. It is now 3 o'clock. If just 2 members demanded, and I think they deserve it, equal time to address this question and provide slides, we would be here till tomorrow. We do not have enough time because we're supposed to go to break at 3:15. We're supposed to finish at 6. By the chair taking up testimony, unless that is the task force comments and questions portion of it, not putting aside what the member.
DOJ allowed me to.
Can I finish my point of order?
Well, what is the point of order? What's the point of order?
That you were out of order. and that you gave a
I was out of order.
presentation, and that's okay. That's fine. But every member here should be allowed same. And if you look at our time, for us to do that, it would be impossible to even come close to the amount of time and presentation that was presented. And so I don't know what to do other than you may have forced us to delay the vote again. I'm not discounting
No, I didn't.
Member
That's
Lewis's
not a point of order. Parliamentarian Johnson, can you
but
please
that's
Parliamentarian Johnson,
Yes,
and clarify what's the point of order?
his point of order, Madam Chair, is that you you went beyond the scope of the comments, and it became a discussion and a presentation. And his point of order is that was out of order.
Okay,
And
so Parliamentarian Johnson, one moment. If that was an issue, then why didn't you, as parliamentarian and Attorney Newman, inform me that that was out of order? Because I sent the presentation to you before the hearing, and I told you all
may
what.
I just say,
Hold on, I'm not member member Joan Sawyer. I am talking to Parliamentarian Johnson and Attorney Newman. I sent Attorney Newman, Damon, and Parliamentarian Johnson this presentation beforehand. Before I even sent them the PowerPoint, I told them that I had last week.
you sent it this morning, not within the amount
now
of
we're playing
time that
games.
you're supposed to send it, so that we could all have it, or we could read it, we could digest it, or that we could be prepared. We, meaning the commission and everyone listening, could be prepared. That is part
Point
of
of
the.
order, there's a motion on the floor. Point of order, there's a motion on the floor by member
I
Scott
think
Lewis.
the point of order
Member
takes
Scott
precedence.
Lewis.
Okay, may I please have the floor for a moment? I can't answer for Mr. Newman, and I'm not going to attempt to. What I'm dealing with is what was raised today at this time. The unfortunate, pardon me? So the unfortunate part is that it was raised at the end of the presentation. And the other issue is to whom is the point of order raised to? And since it concerns the chair, it would have to be raised to the vice chair. And they would have to rule on that point of order. I don't know what member Joan Sawyer is asking for. I mean, his request, so I don't know what his request is.
My request is equal time for every member here to have a discussion like the chair did on the community of eligibility.
This is Bradford. Can I be seen or can I be heard? Because I can't see myself.
We can
Can I
see
be
you,
seen as well?
Senator. We can see you.
Oh, okay. I'm just curious, and I hear valid arguments on both sides. I think what the chair was saying, that she had presented the presentation, and I guess if it was out of order, she was expecting to be made aware of it at that time. I don't want to put my words in the mouth, but it was presented, so be out of order, she made aware of that, and she probably could have held off making a presentation. Mr. Jones Sawyer is on point again, and seeing that now members are entitled to equal time to make a similar presentation or argument on who's the community of eligibility. My question is, again, we're running against the clock. What prevents us from taking this vote tomorrow morning?
Member Bradford, would you repeat your question?
What prevents us from taking this vote tomorrow morning?
I can respond as a member of the work on it, which is that the economists cannot start their work, and we cannot have the conversation that is slated for this afternoon's business unless we decide on the community of eligibility.
What is less than 12 hours change in that work? What will they achieve if it gives people enough time to get comfortable or make their arguments through the balance of the day and then take this vote up before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, what changes?
Well, if you want to delay, then what we perhaps can do is move the scope of work conversation to tomorrow and then continue the cumulative eligibility discussion.
I'm not necessarily saying I want to delay, but I just feel that it's some unreadiness by some members.
Member Bradford, it would respond to the questions of both parties. When Member Lewis made the motion, it hasn't been seconded. When it is seconded, that means that you go to a discussion. And at that time, Madam Chair will call on those individuals who have discussion. And
This is Montgomery Step. I will second it.
Pardon me? So that's
This
one
is
way.
Okay, it's been
Montgomery Step. I will second it.
Okay, can we get some professionalism in here? Thank you. So it has been properly moved and seconded that the community of eligibility is defined or prescribed to a person who is an African American descendant of enslaved person in the United States, or Jovan Scott, could you repeat this? Sorry, could you restate the motion? Sorry.
Yes, I can restate the motion. So I move that we define the community of eligibility based on lineage determined by an individual being an African American descendant of a chattel enslaved person or the descendant of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century.
Thank you. So it has been properly moved and seconded that the task force adopt a lineage model.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get who seconded it.
Monica Montgomery Step.
Thank you.
So it has been properly moved and seconded that the task force prescribe a lineage model where an African American descendant of a chattel enslaved person or a free African American who was present in the United States before the 20th century. Is that the motion, Scott Lewis?
Yes, that's the motion.
Thank you. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Yes.
I second the motion.
The motion's already been seconded.
I have this. May I speak?
I call for the question. Call for the question, Madam Chair.
No,
Madam
we
Chair,
have
you
people
have
who
to
want
allow.
speak.
Sorry,
You have to allow
Brown.
discussion.
Hold on, Parliamentarian Johnson, please.
Yes,
I
Madam Chair.
will recognize. Hold on, Member Grills. Thank you, Member Grills. Go ahead.
I'm truly stunned by this afternoon. I thought that we were to have dedicated time as members of the task force to consider the testimony from our witnesses. We had an unexpected witness in the form of our chair that I've never seen anything like that before. And I'm surprised that Member Lewis went straight to a motion without us having an opportunity for discussion. There were pros and cons associated with the witness testimony. And we haven't had a chance to discuss that. So I don't
Chair
feel
Moore.
we should be doing a vote at this point. We didn't follow our own procedure.
Chair Moore.
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
To respond to Member Grill's comment about my introduction of the motion, I introduced the motion so that we can actually have the discussion. I conferred with the Department of Justice last week about introducing the motion so that we could actually structure the discussion. And once it was brought to a vote, the task force has the right still to vote it down. After which, another member is very free to introduce an alternative motion, and we can continue to go that way. The point is to actually structure the time that we have, as opposed to an open discussion, which may not necessarily yield any clarity, and have a repetition of the delay that we had at the last meeting. So my introduction to the motion does not preclude our ability to discuss. In fact, it secures it.
Exactly.
Thank you for that clarification.
I call for the question, Madam Chair.
The question has been called. Parliamentarian Johnson.
Is there a
Please.
second? You really need to have discussion, full discussion. And if you don't do that, then well, let me put it this way. The whole point of a motion on the floor is to allow for a discussion. So when Member Lewis made the motion and it was seconded, that was saying that the body was ready to move forward with a discussion. So if you call for the question before any discussion, that would not be pursuant to parliamentary rules or Robert's rules.
Madam Chair, I have a point of order. Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized. Yes, you're recognized.
When anyone is unready to vote, they will have their due opportunity for discussion. This motion is before the House. This matter was before the House, so to speak, previously, and it was delayed. So whoever wants to make additional comment are entitled to do that during the time of unreadiness. Hello?
On the,
I'm not certain what you meant, so.
That's what they're doing. I mean,
if a person has any, let me back up and repeat it again. If a person has further information, input they want to give to talk, that is done during the time of unreadiness.
We're at the time of readiness, but you keep calling
Parliamentarian Johnson, I have a question because at the last hearing, there was no discussion. Well, I think Parliamentarian Johnson, you as a parliamentarian, you didn't necessarily allow for discussion when I believe Reggie Jones Sawyer at the last meeting called to table the vote.
That's because that's the rule. That's a rule of order. Yes. When you move to table, you're not permitted to discuss it. You move right to the question. That's just the way the rule is set in Robert's rule. So there's no discussion. You move to vote, and then if it passes, then you table it and you move on with your agenda. In this case, you do have discussion. This was not a motion to table. So it is appropriate to ask for discussion after a motion has been seconded. In this instance, the motion was seconded. At that point, you were doing correctly, Madam Chair, when you asked for discussion. But you also have, if you remember that the rules say that you must allow for discussion. So you cannot use, a call for the question to deny the opportunity for discussion. So after there's been discussion, like as you normally do, you ask for discussion. And then when there's either no more discussion or when discussion has been going for a while, then it would be appropriate to move to, call the question, at which point, if the body decides that 2/3 of the body decides that they've had enough discussion, then they can vote, for the call of the question, and that would lead you to the vote itself. But right now, it's clear that there's unreadiness, but that unreadiness is because they want to discuss it.
All right. Okay. Okay, thank you. Is there any other discussion on the motion on the floor? Member Jones Sawyer, are you trying to be recognized? You're on mute.
I'm looking at the time. We're supposed to be at break right now, and then we're supposed to in 15 minutes discuss the discussion of scope of work. If I spend the next, 45 minutes as you did, the chair, to go into my presentation, and then another member goes into it, are we then now pushing discussion of the scope of work? Because I'm also trying to be sensitive to our 6 o'clock, hopefully our 6 o'clock hard stop this evening, so that we can also discuss other matters. And so I don't know what to do other than if we
You
were
have a
supposed to bring back a presentation like you did, then I would like time to put together a PowerPoint presentation just like you did. That's all I'm
do
saying.
you have a
That means
comment?
everybody on
Do you
here
have
has
a
an
comment on
opportunity
the
to bring back a PowerPoint presentation. You were out of order by doing that, and that's what's complicating things. And this is supposed to
respectfully?
be commenting on what was presented, not necessarily another testimony.
Well, that wasn't testimony. I'm the chair, and I have the authority to guide the discussion how I see fit. If there was an issue, Attorney Newman, Damon, and Parliamentarian Johnson would have raised that before the hearing.
You are absolutely right.
And
You're the
so
chair.
the motion, do you have a comment
You
on
are
the
the chair,
motion
but
on the floor?
you're not the dictator. You are
I
the
never
chair.
said I
You are
was.
supposed to guide, and you're supposed to follow the rules that are set aside for the proper way that a commission or committee should flow. We should not be having this discussion right now, because you're also supposed to keep us target on our time, and that was not done. So that is part of what the chair is supposed to do.
Madam Chair.
If you want me to begin, and if I last until 6 o'clock talking forever, and then another one, I just want to make sure we all have equal time.
Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Madam Chair, members of the commission. I hate to say this, but must we adopt the practices of other bodies that have been working against our best interests to do what appears to be happening now? We have sufficiently been informed of the positions of everyone on this commission regarding this issue. And finally, I still contend that for this mission to be, or this task force to be solved by positions that are obviously counter to what Dr. Weber had in mind. That's the thing that's painful. Yes, people are entitled to their opinions. A lot of opinions have already been discussed by this body, and not everyone had due process on. So should we be suggesting that people have not had the opportunity to say what they wanted to say? And each of us has heard all of the public testimony, which was overwhelmingly supportive of the originator's position on who's entitled. But if the body wants to give grace and additional time, through a democratic process, it can be determined this afternoon. But in terms of additional information, an additional presentation, which we all know what it's about, I think we should get on with the charge, purpose, and task of this reparations task force.
Thank you, Vice Chair
Tamar,
Brown. Member
Tamar,
Tamaki,
may I be?
recognized.
So I'm wondering if there's a third option here, and I'm very sensitive to what Member Scott Lewis is saying, that we have to have a decision in order to guide the economists, and to put this over anymore is going to be it's going to be very difficult for everybody. At the same time, I do want to hear everybody's opinion on this and everybody's discussion. I don't think that should be cut short, but I do think we need to get on with it. So would it be possible, and I ask this to Parliamentarian Johnson also, that we start the discussion, we put over the discussion of the scope of work until tomorrow. We reschedule, regretfully, but we reschedule one or more of the witness panels, and then we have a vote and we decide this tomorrow, after everybody has had the opportunity to say what they need to say. But we bring this basically to a vote so we can get on with the economists and provide them with guidance so we can move the ball forward. With respect to the witness testimony, we would have to renotice and apologize to them, but renotice their testimony for 2 weeks from now in April. But that would open up the morning or the morning and part of the afternoon to actually get this done. And I think that would accommodate every member's desire to speak their mind on this very, very crucial, pivotal issue. I wonder if that's a possibility.
Respectfully,
I
Member
have a
Tamaki.
question for Mr. Tamaki. I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Vice Chair Brown.
Mr. Tamaki, when are you suggesting to be the drop dead point for us to vote on this issue? When?
I would have expected that we would have voted today, but given the time constraints, I think what we're talking about realistically is tomorrow, sometime tomorrow morning, perhaps, or tomorrow early afternoon.
What I'm saying, definitely.
Definitely, definitively.
When are we going to vote on the people's agenda?
May I please interject? More?
Yes, Member Lewis, go ahead.
Thank you.
You're
So
recognized.
today in our schedule, we had 2 hours slated for the discussion. We still have more than 2 hours remaining in our meeting time today. And so if we simply move this afternoon's business to tomorrow, we can have the allotted original time for discussion and come to a vote today. I'd like to also remind my fellow task force members that we also began this discussion last meeting. And there were some of us who actually took some time during that meeting to speak at length. So this is not a brand new discussion. We're not starting from scratch. We are continuing discussion from last meeting. We continued the meeting, meaning this discussion from last meeting, because some members wanted additional information which the witnesses provided today. The purpose of those witnesses was to provide clarity to those members who were unwilling and unready to vote last meeting. So to my mind, if we move this afternoon's business to tomorrow, given the fact that those members who needed further clarification from witnesses have received it, we have enough time to come to a decision today. I'll remind everybody that the Economist team does not feel comfortable moving forward with any discussion of the scope of work until we have concluded our discussion and have voted on the community of eligibility. We have enough time. It's 3:30. Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Bradford's
Thank you.
hands up.
Yeah, hold on. I'll just say this, Don Tamaki, then I'll recognize Member Bradford and then Vice Chair Brown. I agree with Member Scott Lewis. I think that we can take the rest of the meeting to discuss this. I do not agree that we should extend this any longer than, I don't think we should extend it to tomorrow, particularly because in terms of your suggestion, in terms of counseling witnesses, Brian Stevenson, who is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, he was supposed to present testimony on the criminal justice panel for this March. But because we delayed the vote at the February meeting, we had to reschedule the criminal justice panel, which was supposed to be today, until tomorrow. And he couldn't fit to March 30th on his schedule. So now we can't hear from someone like Brian Stevenson on these particular issues. So that's why I'm against delaying this eligibility vote, because it's impacting the rest of our work, like the scope of work for the economic consultant team and the other panels that we have. So Member Bradford, go ahead.
I'm in agreement with both Member Tamaki and Scott Lewis. So I'm trying to split the baby, and what I tried to suggest about a half hour ago was to afford that discussion that really didn't take place, that Mr. Jones Sawyer was speaking to allow members to vet out what those concerns were. I was one of those members in February who was unready. It's not that I needed additional information. I wanted additional information. I want to hear. Unfortunately, today I was chairing a committee where I let people have ample discussion, discuss their pros and cons on legislation that prevented me from hearing the discussion that I want to hear today. So I had to afford that as chair, and I think that's what Mr. Jones Sawyer was just saying. Before you take any vote, you still have a level of dialogue and discussion on what your positions are, and that's what didn't take place. And I think I don't want to speak to Mr. Jones Sawyer because he can speak on his own, but I too, as an elected official who chairs meetings, I've granted reconsideration or, yielded more time so my members of my committee could ask the questions that they needed. I did that all morning from 9 a.m. to noon today. So that's what we're seeing. Yes, we can have that discussion now, but I'm just saying it should happen.
We have 2 hours and
Madam
just want
Chair.
to be mindful. One moment,
Yep.
Vice Chair Brown. Just want to be mindful. There is a motion on the floor right now that has been properly moved and seconded by Member Scott Lewis and Member Montgomery Steppe. And the motion that's on the floor right now is the task force adopting a pure lineage model based on if you're a descendant of an enslaved African person in the United States or a descendant of a free African American who was here in the 20th century. That is on the floor. So we have time now to discuss the motion on the floor. Let's get into the discussion. Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
You've lost my sentiment. What you saying, Madam Chair?
Chair Moore. Chair Moore, this is, yes.
Okay.
I understand
Yes.
you're getting ready to move into your discussion. The experts are waiting on the line because 3:30 was the time that they were scheduled to have the discussion of the scope of work. So I would need to get direction from the task force if it is your intent to hear from them tomorrow and to use the remainder of your time today to discuss community of eligibility, then we should probably let them know so that they can go on about their day, and hopefully they'll be available tomorrow to rejoin the task force.
Okay, so we'll take consensus. So I'll go one by one to each member to see what, as a consensus, what our objective will be. I'll start with, in the order of my screen, Member Bradford. Would you like for the economic team to meet tomorrow instead of this afternoon so that we can have more time to discuss the motion on the floor?
I'm always going to yield to more time and more discussion, so the answer would be yes.
Thank you. Member Tamaki?
I'd like to take a vote on this today after we hear the discussion. and that I would expect that before 6:00 p.m. we will have made a decision. This necessarily means that we probably would have to talk to the experts tomorrow morning, if I hope that they're available.
Thank you. Member Jones Sawyer,
Yes.
Member Grills, Member Holder,
Yes.
Member Scott Lewis,
Yes, I'd like to move the afternoon's business to tomorrow and continue discussion.
okay,
to the
Vice
rest.
Chair Brown. Okay, sorry about that. Vice Chair Brown,
Yes, we finalized today what we should do today and have a discussion now.
Member
can't
Member
wait till
Montgomery
tomorrow.
Step.
Hello?
I really do not want to wait until tomorrow.
Yes. Archie's going to be a while. Are you okay?
Parliamentarian Johnson, could you mute, please? Thank you. I really feel like we need to make a decision today. We have been discussing for like 45 minutes procedure and haven't gotten to the substance of the actual motion, which I think that is also time wasted. I'm looking at the agenda for tomorrow. Having to tell people who have duly prepared for this and to present to us that, at the last minute that we will not have them present, I think is something we've already done in delaying this discussion before. In addition to that, when we had asked for just a simple doodle poll to go out last month for a May meeting, it did not go out, even though we had not decided if we were going to do a May meeting yet. I say that to say that we can't keep pushing stuff back, especially because we really just have one more meeting until the doggone report comes out. And so for me, I don't think that we should move anything. I think if we put a time limit on this particular discussion and then start with the economists after that until 6:00, then that would be something that we should do. But I don't think we should delay it. I don't know that any more information is going to kind of change where we are. I support the motion on the floor. I seconded it. So the answer is no, I don't think we should delay.
Thank you. Member Grills, I don't, did you say anything?
No, I didn't hear you call me.
Oh.
So I'm with the folks that said yes.
Okay, so, all right, it's good to know where everyone stands. I do agree with Monica Montgomery's step. If we can, get the substance of the discussion going and hopefully come to a vote, we could potentially still hear from the economic consultants, but they may have to be moved until the next day, till tomorrow morning. I know that's not a definitive answer, Damon, but it is what it is. So I guess based on what everyone said, I think we'll just aim for them presenting tomorrow morning. But I hope that they can be on standby in case, in case we can move forward this afternoon. So that's the answer. So let's just move back to the motion that's on the floor that's been properly moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the substance of the matter? I'll just start by saying, you look at the statute at AB 3121. Each of the statutory provisions are lineage specific. So to member Reggie Jones Sawyer or to anyone else who is expressing hesitancy to a provision that is race-based at all, because my fear is that people's ideologies are being imposed into what should be a statute-driven process that's supported by the legislative history and, of course, the legislative intent of the lead author, which is Secretary Weber. She stated that AB 3121 is lineage specific, and that's supported by a dispassionate analysis of the statutory provisions itself. So again, my question is there anything in the statute that purports that this task force and proposals that are supposed to emanate from them should be?
Madam Chair.
Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, you're recognized.
So as one of the co-authors of AB 3121, which means I also wrote the bill. She was the primary author, but as the co-author of the bill, in the analysis done by the Senate Judiciary, they write in their report, in the executive summary, since we're talking about constitutional or legislative intent and all of that, AB 3121, and this is the direct quote, does not focus on reparations for the injuries inflicted by slavery alone. Instead, this bill will charge the task force with studying all of the systemic racism that pervades U.S. history in California, in which California was often a willing participant, that is responsible for the myriad of structural inequalities experienced by African Americans today. So, as with all due deference to the chair, this is from about 1,000 lawyers that are working over here in the Capitol, who helped put this together, who put probably the most comprehensive analysis in the Senate Judiciary Committee before it came over, and was added, specified there is a special consideration of African Americans who are descendants of people enslaved in the U.S., in the United States, which was added after this report. The problem is it was not really defined. It doesn't exclude, doesn't quite include. And I think that's part of our difficulty, because we're interpreting the intent of what 120 people who voted on this believed it would be. And it was not clearly spelled out here in the legislation. So we can't really use this legislative intent. In addition, and I think Mr. Bradford will agree with me, the Secretary Weber had concern, and serious concern, and I have the same, the exact same, that we all believe, and I will agree that everybody on this watching and everybody that gets a chance to vote believes that all roads start with chattel slavery. That is how we begin. And there's absolutely no disagreement with that. None. And the fact that we all came in, whether on a slave ship or a cruise ship, guess what? We're all in the same boat now. And so we've got to make recommendations that are sustainable to move on. This is not, look, I worked in the mortuary industry for a long time. This discussion sounds more like people bickering over inheritance, over money we ain't got. You know, what does old folks say? You got a pot to piss in? We don't even have the pot. And we're arguing over cash payments, which I firmly don't believe are the be-all and end-all. And if Member Scott would work with us, or we would come together in some kind of consensus to say, absolutely, his first part is spot on. It's really about descendants of chattel slavery, the ones that were here, because that's how they based the racism on our people for centuries and centuries. But this is more of like a class action lawsuit where a company pollutes the river and that river flows into a community and poisons people. We have a river of racism that is perpetrated either by this government, by white people, by slavers, all started again with racism and has flowed into our communities and has been poisoning us for centuries. Now is the time, not only for us to get some type of reparations for that, for the harm, because that's what happens in a class action lawsuit. There's financial reparations. But they don't leave the polluter. They don't allow that polluter to continue to pollute. And it's almost as if, give me cash, but I don't care if the river keeps polluting our people. I think we need to do jointly both making sure that systemic racism within the society and everything, that we do everything to make recommendations, again, to make recommendations to the legislature and ultimately the governor. Because no matter what amount we recommend, no matter what laws we recommend, no matter what statutes we recommend, they're merely recommendations to the legislature who will ultimately make the decision of what moves forward. And so I believe looking at harm, again, beginning with descendants of slaves, that is the harm. I believe we can prove harm, just like you can prove harm with a polluting agency or a polluting company. We can prove harm, and that anybody in the right mind or who's not prejudiced will go ahead and go along and make sure that we are able to reduce and hopefully over a long period of time eliminate that harm. The second part of this is this genealogy stuff. Look, genealogy and my PhD friends, people who've gone through peer review, who've gone extensive analysis on whatever their dissertation is, genealogy has not been recognized as a standalone field of academic study. A degree in history is probably the most best associated option or the closest option to genealogy. Now, there is a growing number of universities, colleges, which offer individual courses or affiliated diploma certificates. But bottom line, to become a genealogist, there are no educational requirements. And for some people, this is a hobby. We can go through, and I listen to all of the genealogy folks. Not one of them, I would say all of them, I would trust to go through my genealogy. I've had the Mormons go through mine. They can only go back to 1940. What about foster kids that was mentioned earlier, other people who may not know who their parents are and how far they can go? Do we exclude them even though they are descendants of chattel slavery? Do we take any one certificate or whatever saying that they are descendants of slaves when we have no real verifiable quantitative analysis of anybody that they are descendants of slaves? Very few of us can find those documents. But again, what about the ones, let's just say most of us can. What about the ones that can't? Do we leave them behind? And that is also wrong. And so that's why I'm looking more at a comprehensive look at this and look at it as a class action suit based on the harms of chattel slavery, because I believe and I hope it includes what Dr. Lewis is talking about, and then looks not just monetary, but looks at all the other things we could look at that impacts how slavery has adversely impacted us. examples, which we should be talking to the economists about. How do we provide money so that we can own property, close the wealth gap? How can we make sure that our kids get the proper education because they live in squalor and poverty, or in neighborhoods that don't provide the schooling that they need to succeed? How do we level that playing field since affirmative action is not there? How do we do that? That's the discussion I really want to have, not this. To me, this is just a small part of it. And we're arguing over on pennies of the dollar.
Member Jones
The
Sawyer,
other thing, at the end of the day, Dr.
but
Weber,
we're
wait a
talking,
minute, see
talking
what
about work of coming up with the reparations plan, which is what we're spending the next several months doing. Right, so you're talking about guaranteeing against repetition of injury. That's part of the thing that we have to work out.
Correct.
The
But does your
slavery,
Dr. Lewis, does your motion take that into consideration?
And I think so all of what you're saying, I don't disagree with. And I'm responding to you because you mentioned my name, and I don't disagree.
Yeah, and I would like to finish.
Okay,
that's what I meant by I didn't say anything when the chair kept going on and on and on and on with her. It was allowing people to be able to say something, and then they finish, then another person speaks. But that's what the chair is supposed to do, to be able to. We're supposed to speak through the chair, not to each other. That's how commissions and committees work. And so in many ways, I'm talking to the
raising
chair.
my hand to be recognized for some time, and I haven't been. So Chair Moore, please, when you see it fit, please recognize me so that I may respond to Assembly Member Jones Sawyer.
And
Yes,
you should
members.
be right after I finish. So I
Okay,
also believe that Dr. Weber has a concern, and a right concern. We go about Brown versus Board of Education. The Jim Crow laws we helped to dismantle, the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, and just figuring out a way to close the wealth gap. Other people are taking advantage of it. White women and others have been able to take advantage of it more than anybody else. So Dr. Weber is really concerned that we take care of Black people, African American, just Black people who've been. And so when she thinks about descendants of slaves, she's thinking, let's try to make sure that everything springs from that, so that with that, by us doing that, we don't allow others to come in and corrupt. And I'll end with this. The last thing we want is someone that we believe is obviously white coming in with false documents saying that they're Black and they're descendants of slaves, because we have not done the work of implementation to make sure that whoever comes and tries to take advantage of whatever we come up with, we can verify that that their family history has been harmed by it. And I'll be quiet until my next time.
Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you. So, Member Jones Sawyer, thank you for that. As I was stating when I interrupted you, and apologies for the interruption, I know it's not polite to interrupt, but I know it doesn't breach the actual rules of Robert's rules to interrupt when someone is speaking during the discussion. But alas, my mother taught me to be polite, and I've let her down today. Now, what I was saying was that I agree with you, right? You are exactly right, but what you're pointing to are actually issues that are matters of concern further down in our process. So you're talking about the impacts of racism and anti-Blackness that emerge out of the period of slavery that we can account for and respond to through a full scope of a reparations policy that could be one part cash for the identified eligible community to whom we are discussing, of whom we're discussing, and also we can introduce recommendations for policies, right? Again, to guard against repetition. Now, what's important to remember is that, and listen, I am, right, a non-descendant of U.S. chattel slavery Black person. My people were enslaved, but not here. And so I recognize, right, what you're saying. But what we have to appreciate is that all of the anti-Blackness that all Black people face when they come from wherever they may come from to the United States is an anti-Blackness that was designed intentionally, right, and expertly refined against the population of Black people who were enslaved in this country. They are the referent of anti-Blackness that other Black people, once they arrive at whatever stage of arrival, are catching hell because of the sheer purpose, right, of the anti-Blackness against descendants of enslaved Africans, Americans in this country. So it stands to reason that if we remedy, right, that initial injury, meaning if we provide reparation for the injuries faced by this particular community and their descendants, that the benefits, meaning changing the actual terms of Black life more broadly in the country, will benefit people like myself. So I don't think we have a difference of opinion here, sir. What I think we have to do is we have to say, well, the fact that the notion of slavery comes up over a dozen times in AB 3121, the fact that repeatedly AB 3121, and I wasn't in the room when it was written, right? And I don't have that privilege. And I don't think as a task force member, I'm expected to have that privilege in order to do the work that I've been asked to do. Now, what I do know is that throughout AB 3121, there's constant reference to the lingering effects of slavery, which means that the idea of harm is not necessarily about slavery per se, right? And this speaks to your earlier comment about the lawyers and legal scholars who you have working on interpreting the law. But the fact that, again, slavery functions as the anchor referent for the injustices that have continuously been perpetuated against the same source group. So when we are talking about the grandfather clause that prohibited African Americans from voting, right, at the very beginning of Jim Crow, right? These were laws that were created to suppress the political will of descendants of enslaved Africans in this country. Meaning all of the forms of anti-Blackness that we talk about, right, were effectively patterned off of this principal disparity, this principal violence against this particular. And so that's what we're trying to work out today. And if you don't agree with it, that's fine. Right? You can enter in your nay to the motion, and then we can move on to some other kind of proposal. But the point is just that this is going to be a longer process where we can start talking about housing policies and we can start talking about environmental issues. That's the scope of work that we want to get to, but we can't get to it because we can't decide in principle, right, who the community of eligibility is. And that's what we need to do today, is determine who we're talking about, because as an advisory committee member with The Economist, they have told Chair Moore and myself directly that they're uncomfortable making too many recommendations on how we should organize the scope of, or how they should organize the scope of work, because they see it, appropriately so, as our responsibility. So they can't really get started until we finish this particular task. So I think we have to absolutely think about the entirety of reparations. And that's why if you look at the proposed schedule of meetings, Chair Moore and I have devoted literally every single of our remaining meetings to addressing various components of a reparations program and package. How are we dealing with the question of compensation? Let's spend 2 days talking about frameworks of compensation. How do we deal with the framework of atonement, right, and apology? How do we deal with policies? These are all things that we have plenty of time to incorporate and to debate on, but we can't do any of that work until we get this community eligibility question sorted.
So
Any other members?
This is
Member Holder, you're right.
Yeah, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I'm having to hold a camera separate from my computer, so I may look strange or wonky. The first thing I want to address is really what I'd like to talk about is this legal framework. Because I honestly, I think that's my value add. I think there's a lot of midnight, lawyers, making comments. I'm not addressing you, Assemblyman, but a lot of folks who are not lawyers and who have not actually been in the trenches for decades as lawyers, making comments about the state of the law, specifically about the state of the 13th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So for the last 20 years, I have been a civil rights lawyer. And I have crafted arguments around the 13th and 14th Amendment in my litigation in both federal and state court. Earlier on, in one of our first meetings, a young man named Queka Smith came in. He's a Morehouse attendee, and he talked about a case, a 14th Amendment case that ended the use of the SAT and the ACT at the UC, in the UC system, the University of California system. That was my case. I was the attorney on that case. And I crafted a 14th Amendment argument to the state court indicating that the SAT and the ACT should be prohibited under the 14th Amendment because of their ingrained bias against disabled people and African Americans and people of color. And based on my 14th Amendment arguments, the judge in that case granted an injunction that told the University of California, you can no longer use the test. I intimately understand the 13th and 14th Amendment. I was also one of the co-chairs of the campaign to eliminate Proposition 209. And in that role, in the Proposition 16 campaign to eliminate Proposition 209, I worked with Dr. Weber to help